Stay tuned after the conclusion of the podcast for additional important information. Subscribe for more episodes connecting macro trends to portfolio strategy and visit PIMCO.com for extensive research and resources. Welcome to Fixing Your Interest. In today's episode, John Studzinski, PIMCO Vice Chairman, speaks with Libby Cantrill, PIMCO's Head of Public Policy, to get the view from Washington on the big topics of the moment. Together, they explore what might come next in the Iran conflict, as well as its implications for the midterm elections and the US relationship with China. They also look at what lies ahead for the Federal Reserve and its chair-in-waiting, Kevin Warsh.
Libby, I know you're I won't say veteran because that sort of dates you. I won't say it dates you, but you've been close to Wall Street and this interesting combination of Wall Street meets Washington now for about 20 years. And you've seen a lot and you have an extraordinary network there. You're also very savvy with your PIMCO life at markets. But have you seen anything like what we're dealing with today? This incredible overlap of the geopolitical shock of Iran, the impact on energy, the impact on supply chains, and how is this going to come out? Because we also have an election coming up, a big election coming up in terms of who controls the House and possibly the Senate in the first week of November.
Yeah, well, it's wonderful to be with you, John. Talk about a veteran in terms of, and I'm not going to date you, but in terms of your incredible network, both in and out of Washington. So great to be here with you. You know, when I started at PIMCO as an intern in 2006, but then full-time in 2007, I think there was a question of whether do you really need somebody to be kind of the eyes and ears in Washington as it relates to an investment house. I think the financial crisis back in 2008 was kind of the first case in point that, yes, we do need sort of some boots on the ground to figure out what is happening, how will it impact markets, how will it impact our clients, and making sure that we are feeding that then to our investment professionals so they can hopefully make some alpha for our clients. We had the debt ceiling crisis in 2011. I think that was the other sort of the next inflection point. I remember Bill Gross saying, oh, actually, this is useful having you around. And then COVID, of course, and then, fast forward to Trump 2.0. And if you take a sort of a step back on this administration, just in the first 15 months, it's only been 15 months, there's been a lot that's happened. He came to this time in office with a much more maximalist view. I think there's sort of a view of unfinished business, of a sense of urgency. He's not running again. The 22nd Amendment is very clear in the Constitution that he cannot run again. So I think what we have seen over the last 15 months is somebody who knows that he has a limited political runway, that he wants to achieve these things. And, as it relates to the subject at hand with the Iranian war, I think he has had this view of Iran since 1979. I mean, there were interviews in the 1980s where he was talking about Iran. And certainly his first Trump administration, I feel like they withdrew from the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement. And I think there was sort of this view that there was still more to be done. And so I think in lots of ways, what we're seeing today is him trying to kind of, President Trump trying to sort of fulfill those things where he did feel that they were sort of unfinished and kind of open-ended. But as it relates to markets, I mean, if you need any sort of evidence that what Washington does matter to markets, it's really through the energy channel. And, if you had our commodities folks, Greg Share now, he would say this is the biggest disruption to the energy markets ever. Now, the U.S. might be a little bit more protected because we're now an energy exporter versus an energy importer, so maybe a little bit less dependent. But globally speaking, this is an energy shock that, again, our commodity folks would say we've never seen. So, to sort of sum it up, Washington does matter to markets. It certainly mattered during the last 15 months. And I would argue that as government gets more and more sort of embedded in the economy, as fiscal dominates, as monetary policy dominates, I don't think this is going away. I think politics will kind of always matter to market participants going forward.
So Do we think the Mideast has changed now forever in terms of how people regard the Mideast? We have an enormous number of clients there, big pools of capital in the Mideast, across the Mideast. And of course, it's regarded as a major crossroads internationally in terms of travel and logistics. And actually, the Magnificent Seven, as you know, were putting a lot of their data centers there. And they're now thinking, actually, I think they're not just thinking, they're deciding perhaps this is not a good idea because it's a war zone. Maybe we'll move our data centers back to Central Europe, possibly to Australia or India.
And I'd love to hear your answer to this, just because of all the time that you spend in the region. But I think if you just in terms of the way that the Middle East and our European allies sort of view America as it relates to this decision. I mean, if you go back to earlier this year, the president felt quite emboldened by the military operation that took place in Venezuela. That was, agree with it or disagree with it. It was
Seemed like
flawlessly executed. It really was. And actually, the preceding months have been relatively stable in Venezuela. Sort of the plan is working as they had anticipated it. So I think that there was maybe maybe we could argue the wrong lesson learned from that, but a lesson learned from that as it relates to Iran. And I think that has sort of emboldened the president, that he felt like, he could do it in Venezuela, he could potentially do it in Iran in terms of having a more isolated military strike that could help to sort of decapitate the regime and then lead to maybe this organic regime change. I think there was some risks that were underappreciated. There was an underappreciation of the fact that the Iranians would be so effective in closing the Strait of Hormuz. There would be, I think, an underappreciation that the Iran would then strike against the GCC. I mean, so to your question about remaking. And then I think there would be sort of an underappreciation of just the complexity of the situation. So I think, I'll throw it back to you in terms of what do you think the ramifications are? Because it feels like because of those risks that were underappreciated, do our allies in the Gulf, can they rely on us? Like what is that trust been undermined, and what are kind of implications going forward because of that?
Well, there's no question the U.S. military is the U.S. military, and it has, I think the combination of the U.S. military and the IDF has really resulted in, obviously, the original elimination of the leadership. But of course, when you talk about leadership of Iran, you're talking about a theocracy that's controlled by 90 men. And even if you eliminated half, you'd still have people who are very determined and very resilient in terms of the domestic impact on that. You've emboldened a group of people who are, granted, very controversial in terms of the rights of women, democracy, and all of that. But the Straits of Hormuz, no question, has gone from being a logistical issue historically to now becoming a major choke point between Iran and Oman. And one of the things that we've discovered is how people go about defense is changing drastically. And this whole notion, and you probably see this in Washington, talking about the asymmetrical war that's being fought. America has very expensive equipment. The Iranians are using drones that cost $15,000 per drone to manufacture, and they're very effective. So we've got created a situation in terms of how we're watching a live case study as to how war is being fought in this environment and how it affects energy markets and how it affects supply chains, not really being dependent anymore on one or two or three sources. And I think we see China still being very, very interesting, because we talk about China. China apparently has 26 months of oil in storage. They have
Very prescient.
25 nuclear reactors, but they also are very willing to use coal when they need it. So they have a very diversified source of energy. And I think some of the other major players in Asia and in Europe, this is a big wake-up call, and it will ultimately change how energy is seen as a commodity.
And I would be surprised if the Arab states try to diversify away from the Strait of Hormuz, going forward, right? I mean, this is more pipelines, more making sure that they're sort of going to be decreasing the source of leverage that Iran has kind of validated that they have. I mean, this was sort of always an intellectual idea. This is one of the reasons why other U.S. administrations have not tried to attack Iran. And to be clear, I mean, there are a lot of Iranians, a lot of Iranian hawks in Washington. So this is not a completely, this is not like a Greenland, for instance, where you would have the entire Congress really trying to stop President Trump from doing anything militarily against Greenland. We'll just put that out there.
Or Cuba.
Or Cuba, maybe a little bit more complicated, honestly. But Iran, I mean, the general consensus, and anyone who's getting an intelligence briefing in the United States understands that Iran has been a bad actor for a very long time. So, they don't have a lot of sympathizers on Capitol Hill for sure. So it is a little bit, it's a bit more nuanced, in terms of, I think even, Congress's view or what have you. However, now you kind of fast forward to this point where the president, he's underappreciated these risks, and now he has to decide which way to go. Whether do you sort of declare victory on paper without a real strategic win, and potentially what does that look like? Does that look like the Strait of Hormuz is still closed, or are the Iranians collecting a toll on oil, or do you have to kind of escalate to de-escalate? And does that potentially include ground troops? That is politically so unpopular in the United States. And even though, again, the Iranian regime viewed as a bad actor, lots of Iranian hawks on Capitol Hill, that will really have, very little support, in Washington.
I mean, let's look at the stakeholders here, because we're talking about the U.S. domestic stakeholder. That's very different, because the Mideast players are, even though they're being very discreet about it, majority of the Mideast players are in favor of this. As a matter of fact, one or two of the large oil economies in the Mideast said to me, well, look, we've had a plan in place for 4 years for some type of war between Iran and Israel. We knew this would happen eventually. We're prepared logistically. We knew this would happen. We didn't necessarily know when it would happen. We knew it would happen. So they are tacitly trying to be supportive and encourage what Donald Trump is doing.
Right. And I think he faces that. I think he faces obviously the pressure from Israel as well, in order to keep it going and not to necessarily, declare a victory when there isn't really a strategic victory. At the same time.
And Netanyahu's constituencies are being very tough on him right now about what constitutes victory.
Absolutely.
My sense is they're saying this hasn't been regime change. There hasn't been clarity about the
nuclear
missiles and the nuclear enrichment. So they're the right wing, strong constituency in Israel saying, hello, you haven't accomplished very much.
And I think, and then you kind of go to the United States. And as you know, foreign policy is never kind of a top issue among voters. The Americans have the luxury of it not being a number 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 issue. Usually it's number 8 or 9.
Unless it affects gas and groceries.
But unless it affects gas and groceries, which is where I was going to come to. So even though I think that President Trump from the Arab states, particularly from Israel, will have, and from Israel will have, will continue to have pressure to really keep in there and to drive a hard bargain and what have you. I think he has a lot of domestic pressure just to call it a day. And again, we would argue that maybe that it will be a strategic defeat, but domestically, the longer this goes on and the higher oil prices stay, and I think we could maybe argue about how the oil market is priced right now. I mean, the oil market is quite sanguine about this, right? It has, the high kind of spot month dates, but then kind of in the later contracts, it sort of is assuming this all kind of goes back to normal pretty neatly. And again, I think if our commodity folks were here, they would say that's probably not going to be the case. That even if the Strait were to reopen tomorrow, it's not just about the Strait reopening. It's about, the sort of supply shut-in that we've seen. So it's kind of getting all those wells started again. And just practically speaking, that means that the oil market's not likely to normalize, not just for weeks, but maybe for months. And so that just means you have elevated oil prices, which means you have elevated gas prices. So even if this just domestically in the US, if this ends tomorrow, voters are going to face higher gas prices probably throughout the summer. And of course, as you know, that's sort of peak driving time for Americans. So I do think President Trump, this is he's kind of boxed in here because he has on one hand the Arab states, he has Israel. I think he has his own view of Iran being a bad actor, that he really does want to get some real concessions and some real wins. But then he also has the domestic politics of it, which again are just horrible for him. I can't.
You've been following him for a long time. And as you said very well, he came into a second administration exceptionally well prepared. He chose a cabinet that was very much in line with his policy initiatives. And he's what you would describe as one of the most resilient presidents we've ever seen in terms of taking a position, supporting it, and being very diligent about it and dogged. He doesn't really, now we have the taco nuance that people like to refer to, but in this case, how do you see this evolving in the wake of this election that's coming up very soon?
Yeah, and I think that President Trump is criticized a lot by the U.S. media and the international media for being very, very tactical, for being very sort of just responsive and not strategic. And I would push back on that. I actually think, as we kind of talked about in the very beginning, he's been talking about some of these things, not only since his first administration, but really since the 1980s, the 1990s, when he became kind of a public figure, still private citizen, Iran being one of them, tariffs being another one, this idea of America fighting forever wars, maybe ironically, but he's been very consistent on some of these things. So I do think that it is a tension between wanting to achieve something and looking at his legacy and understanding that he's not going to be running again, with also, again, the domestic political pressures. And I will also say that we're only in April. And as you know, a month is just a lifetime in the political cycle these days. And if you actually look at 2022, in the spring, President Biden was facing very high gas prices, much higher actually than now, $5 per gallon. His approval rating was actually even lower than where Trump's was. And everybody at that point was prognosticating this big Republican wave, that Republicans would take back both chambers of Congress easily, and it would be this huge outpouring. And then you fast forward to right before the election, and the political environment looked very different. And of course, what ended up happening is, yes, Republicans took back the House, not by many seats, though. And in fact, they lost a seat in the Senate instead of winning a seat. So I think this is where it's really difficult, even though everyone wants to extrapolate too much about kind of the political environment, what it looks like now in April of an election year, and fast forward that 7 months to what it actually will be in the election. And just to your kind of my last point, to the kind of the point that you were making, love the president, don't like the president. He's been able to persuade people in his own party to do things that they don't want to do, that they don't usually believe in or don't usually support or what have you. He's been able to really create this movement. I mean, Trumpism is the Republican Party now. And so I do think that even though he's kind of gotten himself in a political box on this Iranian conflict, that don't underestimate him, because he's been able to sort of pull a proverbial, rabbit out of the hat before, and he might be able to do that again. It's just obviously, unlike tariffs, war is much harder to end. Tariffs you can roll on and roll off. Starting a war, as trite as it sounds, is easy. Of course, finishing one, much more difficult.
Now let's change gears here. And how long is Jerome Powell going to be Fed chair?
We were just joking today that we were coming in with headlines of
that's going to. And when do we think Kevin Warsh might be interviewed by the Senate?
Yeah. So I think, a couple of things just to remember, and then I'll get to your question. And you know this very well, but I do think it's just worth reminding folks that, the the Fed is comprised of 7 Fed board governors. Those people are nominated by presidents, confirmed by the Senate. It takes 50 votes to confirm. But the body that actually changes monetary policy and changes balance sheet policy, QT, QE, or what have you, is comprised of a bigger group, the 12 FOMC members that include those 7 Fed board governors and then also the 5 regional presidents. And the reason I know that's pedantic, but it's important because while the chair is important, practically speaking, the chair is just one of 12 who's going to be voting. And you need 7 of 12 to actually change monetary policy. So I think in some ways the market gets,
I think this is actually the first time in history where this has been the case, because historically we've had such strong Fed chairs that have been such dominant media profiles that people, this is the first time we talk about dot plots and all these things, and people are saying, as you said, the constituency voting of the 12.
Yeah.
And because now we talk about the voting and we talk about and each of those Fed chairs, regional chairs, has some type of media profile. So,
yeah.
And they often talk about it in one way or another before the vote. So, but I think this is probably the first time that the public at large really understands that it is
a much bigger group.
It's a consensus.
It's a consensus. And I think, again, the chair, and we have the benefit of having Rich Clarett at PIMCO, who is the vice chair under Chairman Powell. And he'll say that the chair is very important, right? So I don't want to belittle that. But he'll also just remind us very quickly that person only votes once. And so he's only one, it's not Chicago. He's only one of 12. And so while I think it's this question about when Kevin Warsh, who's been nominated for the chairman to replace Powell, when he rolls on, that's important. But I think we just also need to contextualize it that, again, he's only one voice.
Now, you've known Kevin Warsh for a long time.
And so have you. We both worked at him for Morgan Stanley with him and he's a wonderful guy. And I think that he will have no problem getting confirmed. So this is important because Powell's term ends May 15th. I don't think that Kevin Warsh will have, again, any issue getting confirmed. The first stop is the Senate Banking Committee. Then he goes to the Senate. He just needs 50 votes. Republicans have 53. So he will easily get confirmed. He may even get a Democrat or 2 to vote for him. However, the big issue right now is that there's also kind of in parallel and criminal investigation into Chairman Powell that President Trump and his Department of Justice has initiated. And Senator Tillis, a Republican senator, has said he will not let the nomination of Kevin Warsh go through to get to a floor vote or a committee vote until the DOJ withdraws that investigation. And unfortunately, John, you would think that the Department of Justice, because the courts have said in many different motions that this is sort of this case doesn't really have merit and should be thrown out and what have you. And still the Department of Justice is proceeding. So this is a little bit of an own goal, honestly. If President Trump wants his people in, then he needs to allow for this investigation to be concluded and sort of, withdrawn or what have you. But it doesn't look like that. So I think the bottom line for markets is that if you're really obsessed with Kevin Warsh and when he's going to get in, there is I think a high probability that he will not get confirmed until the summer. If not, maybe even later. And it will be dependent on when President Trump's Department of Justice withdraws this investigation into Powell, which has already been sort of objectively kind of, undermined, as it doesn't really have a lot of legal bearing. So it's not like this thing is really that serious. That I don't think the president.
But if it does get resolved, how do you see? I realize we can't predict everything and we don't have a crystal ball, but how do you see Kevin Warsh as a Fed governor?
As a Fed chair, I think he's going to be, I think, will he be maybe more inclined to be a bit more dovish because of the sort of productivity? I don't know. He's a very smart guy. As we all know, he's going to be in the Fed partly for Trump's term, but also then for somebody else's term. So he's also going to be focused on his legacy. So I think he's going to be data oriented, maybe a little bit of a tilt to being dovish, but again, he's only one vote. Our view just on the Fed policy is that we do think that the Fed will be able to get one cut in this year. Now, of course, this is, very much predicated on how the Iranian conflict plays out. But even though folks in the market has been focused on the inflation side of this and the potential inflation shock, there's lots of times in history where an inflation shock turns into a growth shock. And I think that is our concern, is that with higher gas prices, this one big, beautiful bill that was supposed to kind of save the economy in America in 2026, that could, basically be negated because of these higher gas prices, particularly for that lower to middle income cohort. And that could be a drag on growth. And then, of course, if you have less AI, CapEx, and what have you. So this is what we're monitoring. We're monitoring, does this sort of, this energy shock, maybe an inflation shock, really actually turn into quickly a growth shock? And then does the Fed actually, have to cut once or maybe even twice? I mean, that sort of becomes the open question. But our base case at this point, growth is going to, we think that growth ratchets down from kind of the 2% that we had in the beginning of the year to something kind of the 1.5 to a little bit higher. Inflation is going to tick up a little bit because of this conflict in terms of headline inflation, and core could tick up a little bit as well. But again, I think we're more concerned about the downside risks to growth than the concern that inflation is going to become more systematic.
If we didn't have the war, we were looking at an economy that's actually quite resilient, quite strong, and quite robust. That was driven very much last year by the fiscal stimulus of the AI infrastructure build-out. And even today, the Treasury Secretary, Bessent, said that he thought the growth this year was going to be somewhere between 3 and 3.5%, which I thought...
Nominally? I don't know.
I thought it was interesting.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. And it'd be interesting to comment on that, because that, of course, is what the economy probably would do if you didn't have all this uncertainty that the war has introduced.
Yeah, again, and as you know, I've been sort of using this sort of reductive metaphor about President Trump's policies have been sort of this mixture of vegetables and dessert for the economy. And you had sort of the vegetables really front-loaded last year. You had tariffs, you had immigration policy in terms of pulling back on immigration. And then the dessert was going to be in 2026. So we had eaten our vegetables. We were waiting for the dessert. The dessert was going to be the one big, beautiful bill, that big tax bill that was passed last year, but its effects don't really start hitting the economy until this year, particularly the first half of 2026, plus ongoing CapEx investment, plus deregulation, which is also something we shouldn't forget. That's happening in the background. That is a slow burn, but it still does have a positive effect, at least at the margins, in terms of access to capital and in terms of kind of the velocity of money. So, as it relates to banking deregulation in particular. So we were planning on a pretty robust consumer. And that's not to say that can't still come to fruition. It's just, again, the longer this conflict lasts, the more elevated oil prices and gas prices are, the more that is going to hurt the consumer. And again, more at that lower end and middle end, which have a higher marginal propensity to consume, right? They're putting more, every dollar that they get, more into the economy. So if they're pulling back even further because of higher gas prices and because of just, uncertainty about the future, then, I think, again, the economy is maybe will slow more than what Treasury Secretary Bessent would like.
One of the things everyone always talks about when you talk about Trump, and of course he's postponed his trip to China once, but it's now scheduled to take place in about 4 weeks. And of course, the world wants to see America and China have a closer working dialogue and relationship. Obviously, China has come out today making, I don't know if you saw, they made a few comments which Trump supported, saying they were not supporting the Iranian military initiatives in the war in the Mideast. How do you see, obviously, you've talked eloquently over the last several years about China being the true bipartisan issue that Democrats and Republicans alike are very devoted to dealing with China as both a challenge and an adversary. How do you see this from Trump's point of view right now?
Yeah, I think that President Trump actually just posted on Truth Social that he's going to give President Xi a big fat hug when he sees him in May. So, or maybe he was going to give him a big fat hug. Anyway, there's some hugging supposedly that we should be anticipating for that summit. I mean, I think that if I go back to the beginning of Trump 2.0, and the thing that I probably was the most wrong about. I think we've had good calls about some of the things. The thing I was the most wrong about was just about expecting this administration to be a lot more hawkish on China. I would argue President Biden was actually pretty hawkish on China in terms of the export controls, continuing the tariffs. He really was. And I think that the Chinese were a little bit caught off guard, right? That, our friend Gina Raimondo, who's the Secretary of Commerce, and President Biden put these really pretty novel export controls or prohibitions on the U.S. selling advanced semiconductors to China. And so, if anything, I thought it would just be at least a continuation, if not a ratcheting up. And it was initially, right? If you remember, we had that trade embargo on China, 145% tariffs, if you remember, back last spring after Liberation Day. And things did feel like they were escalating pretty quickly. And then, I think then China kind of played their trump card, so to speak, which was around critical minerals. And this is a little bit like the Strait of Hormuz. This is like the source of leverage. And, President Trump's all about leverage and what have you. And I think what China showed is that they do have, again, to belabor the metaphor, a real trump card here in terms of the access to critical minerals and, the fact that they basically put a prohibition of selling critical minerals to us. And that was obviously going to have many downstream consequences for the economy. And so that led the Trump administration to pivot quite quickly, roll off most of the tariffs. We still had to have some tariffs on China. And then really to decrease the rhetoric. And I think that's probably a good thing for the world, right? I think we want these two superpowers to be
allowing NVIDIA to sell
which is
a strategic chip to the Chinese.
Which I think, the press hasn't necessarily covered this as well, but there's a huge backlash on Capitol Hill around that. Republicans and Democrats alike.
People were shocked.
Shocked, and it doesn't make a lot of strategic sense. National security sense and what have you. So I think that from my understanding, some of those sales have actually not gone through, that there have been more delays. Maybe not that surprising. But I think that your question though about, there's the sort of short term, medium term about what happens between the US and China during these last 2.5 years of the Trump administration. But then I think there's a bigger question, what happens between the US and China after Trump leaves? And maybe, I think, my view is that whomever is going to be the president next in 2029 is likely to be more of that conventional Washington approach of viewing China maybe as more of an adversary and at least as a competitor, if not an adversary. And so some of this reprieve maybe that we've gotten between the US and China, I guess I worry, or I think is a likelihood that some of those risks kind of come back and that China really does become more of the focal point in terms of national security perspective, in terms of economic statecraft. And of course, meanwhile, China is just taking advantage of a more distracted America, right? In terms of the technological advances that they're making, in terms of really trying to ingratiate themselves with the rest of the world. And just to wrap this up, I think, what does that mean for kind of markets? It means more volatility. It means more geopolitical volatility. It means more uncertainty. We think that's a great environment for active management or for bonds, of course. But I do think that this is going to be much more the new normal, right? That more geopolitical, again, uncertainty causing market volatility.
Libby, far too short. We could talk for a long time. We could have talked about tariffs. We could have talked about Liberation Day 2, 3.
Yes.
And I'm sure there's a lot more things to come.
Always wonderful to be talking to you, John. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us on Fixing Your Interest, as we explored some of the major geopolitical themes driving markets right now. Stay with us as we continue to navigate the challenges and opportunities across the investment landscape. For deeper insights, analysis, and resources, visit PIMCO.com. The discussion and content provided within this podcast is intended for informational purposes only and may not be appropriate for all investors. Reliance upon information provided in a podcast is at the sole responsibility of the listener. The information included herein is not based on any particularized financial situation or need and is not intended to be and should not be construed as a forecast, research, investment advice, or a recommendation for any specific PIMCO or other security, strategy, product, or service. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. All investments contain risk and may lose value. Investors should speak to their financial advisors regarding the investment mix that may be right for them based on their financial situation and investment objective. Podcasts may involve discussions with non-PIMCO personnel, and such content contain the current opinions of the speaker, but not necessarily those of PIMCO. Other podcasts may consist of audio recording of an existing PIMCO article, and such material contains the current opinions of the manager. The opinions expressed in all podcasts are subject to change without notice. Information contained herein has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, but not guaranteed. PIMCO, as a general matter, provides services to qualified institutions, financial intermediaries, and institutional investors. This is not an offer to any person in any jurisdiction where unlawful or unauthorized. For additional important information, go to www.pimco.com/gbl/en/general/legal-pages/podcast-disclosures.